A lonely millionaire, bedridden and without a family, makes an unusual request to his nurse. He asks her to pretend to be his wife for just one day. What could drive a man with everything money can buy to need such a favor? As the nurse hesitates, she realizes that this is more than a request. It's a desperate plea from a man who has nothing left but his secrets and regrets. What happens next will take them both down a path they never imagined. The day began like any other at St. Mary's Private Hospital, a place renowned not just for its top-notch medical care, but also for its luxurious accommodations, the kind that only the ultra-wealthy could afford. The halls were quiet, with only the soft hum of medical machines and the occasional distant chatter of doctors and nurses moving between rooms. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, a reminder of the sterile environment that housed both hope and despair. Sunlight filtered through the thick curtains of room 512, casting a muted glow across the floor and illuminating the room in gentle light. Emily Parker, a nurse in her late 20s, moved down the corridor with a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her ponytail bounced lightly as she walked, her eyes scanning the patient list for the day. She had a warm smile that seemed to brighten even the most sterile of rooms, and an unwavering dedication to her patients. Today, her shift included caring for a particularly high-profile patient, Victor Hale. Victor Hale was no ordinary patient. He was a name whispered in business circles, celebrated for his savvy investments and immense wealth. Yet outside those circles, Victor was shrouded in mystery. He was known to be a man who kept to himself, fiercely private, rarely photographed, and never seen in public without an air of formality. His presence at St. Mary's had stirred curiosity among the staff. Rumors abounded, from him being terminally ill to having lost everything in a financial scandal. But one fact remained indisputable. Victor Hale was now a man whose fortune could not shield him from the realities of illness. As Emily reached room 512, she paused for a moment to compose herself. She knocked lightly on the door before entering, the soft rapping echoing in the quiet of the hallway. Inside, she found Victor seated in an armchair by the large window, the city skyline stretching out beyond the glass. His figure, once robust and commanding, now seemed almost diminished. The illness had stripped him of the vitality he had been known for, leaving a man who looked older than his 45 years. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," Emily greeted, her voice warm and gentle as she walked toward him. She smiled as she approached, her eyes studying his face. His hair, which had once been a thick, dark brown, now had streaks of gray that matched the pallor of his skin. His eyes, piercing blue, were still sharp but tinged with a weariness that hinted at sleepless nights and constant pain. Victor turned his head slightly, his gaze shifting from the window to meet Emily's. He didn't respond immediately, his expression contemplative as if he were deciding whether or not to speak. After a moment he nodded, acknowledging her presence. Emily began her usual routine, checking his vitals, making small adjustments to his IV, and noting any changes in his condition on her clipboard. As she worked, she spoke in a soft, friendly tone, trying to ease the quiet tension that seemed to hang in the air. "The weather looks lovely today," she said, glancing out the window. "It's nice to see some sunshine after all that rain." Victor's gaze remained on her, his lips barely twitching into what could have been an attempt at a smile. He watched her for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice low and slightly raspy. "Nurse Parker, Emily, isn't it?" Emily paused, a bit surprised by the personal address. "Yes, that's right," she replied, offering him a reassuring smile. "Is there something you need, Mr. Hale? Are you comfortable?" Victor took a deep breath, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest of the chair. There was a hesitation in his movements, a moment of vulnerability that caught Emily's attention. She watched as he seemed to struggle internally, his gaze drifting back toward the window. Finally, he spoke, his voice almost a whisper, the words laden with something unspoken. "I need to ask you something. Something unconventional," he said, his eyes not meeting hers. Emily's hand stilled on the clipboard, her curiosity piqued by the unusual tone in his voice. She turned fully toward him, her brows knitting together in a subtle frown. "Of course, Mr. Hale," she said softly, her tone encouraging. "What is it?" Victor remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the view outside. When he finally spoke again, there was a tremor in his voice that Emily hadn't heard before, a kind of desperation that spoke of a deeper pain. "I know this may sound strange, but I need you to pretend to be my wife," he said, his eyes finally lifting to meet hers, searching for a reaction. "Just for a day." Emily blinked, stunned by the request. In her years of nursing, she had dealt with all manner of patients and all kinds of requests. Some were bizarre, some heartwarming, and others downright peculiar. But this was something entirely different. Her surprise must have shown on her face because Victor gave a weary smile, one that barely reached his eyes. "Pretend to be your wife?" Emily repeated, her voice filled with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. She set the clipboard down on a nearby table, giving him her full attention. "Why would you need me to do that, Mr. Hale?" Victor sighed, his eyes turning away from her again, his gaze dropping to his lap. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was raw, filled with a vulnerability that took Emily by surprise. "I don't have anyone," he said softly. "No one to call family. No friends who would understand. I've spent my life building this empire, but it's empty. And now there's something I need to do, something I need to make right. I need someone by my side, someone who can help me close a chapter of my life." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with an intensity that made Emily's breath catch in her throat. "Just for one day," he repeated. "I promise you, Emily, there is nothing improper about this. I will make it worth your time. I need someone I can trust." Emily could see the raw honesty in his eyes, the pleading in his voice. For all his wealth, all his power, Victor Hale was nothing more than a man facing his mortality alone. There was a loneliness in his gaze that tugged at her heartstrings, a depth of sadness that she hadn't expected. She hesitated, her professional instincts telling her to refuse, to keep her distance. But there was something in Victor's expression that made her pause. "What exactly would this involve?" she asked cautiously, her eyes searching his for answers. She needed to understand, needed to know what she was agreeing to. Victor's eyes softened slightly, and he gave a small nod as if he had anticipated the question. "There's a meeting I need to attend," he explained, his voice steadying. "It's a meeting that will allow me to settle some things, to find closure. The people involved, they would not take me seriously if I showed up alone. They need to believe that I have someone, that I am not as isolated as they think." Emily could feel her heart aching at his words. She had always believed in being there for her patients and doing everything within her power to help them heal, not just physically but emotionally. She could see that this was not about deception or money. It was about something deeper, something that went beyond what Victor was willing or able to say. He needed her help to find peace, to face whatever ghosts haunted him. After what felt like an eternity, Emily finally nodded, her expression softening. "All right, Mr. Hale," she said quietly. "If this is important to you, I'll do it, just for a day." For a moment, Victor seemed taken aback, as if he hadn't truly believed she would agree. Then slowly his lips curved into a faint smile, a smile filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. His eyes seemed to brighten, the shadows in them lifting slightly. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You have no idea what this means to me." Emily gave him a gentle smile, though inside her mind was racing. She couldn't help but wonder what lay behind Victor's request, what secrets he carried, and why he needed to present the image of a loving relationship, even if it was just for a day. As she left the room, her thoughts were filled with questions and a sense of unease settled over her. She had just agreed to something far beyond the scope of her duties as a nurse, and though she wanted to believe that it was for the right reasons, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something far more complicated than she understood. Later that day, Emily found herself at home, sitting on her small couch with a cup of tea in her hands, her thoughts consumed by her conversation with Victor. She replayed every word, every nuance of his expression, trying to make sense of the strange request. Victor Hale was a man of mystery, wealthy, powerful, yet utterly alone. It was clear to her that whatever he was planning had deep personal significance. The loneliness in his eyes, the way his voice trembled when he spoke of having no one, it all hinted at a lifetime of regrets and missed opportunities. Emily had always been someone who felt deeply for others. It was why she had chosen nursing as her profession. She believed in caring for people, in helping them find comfort in their most vulnerable moments. And now it seemed that Victor Hale, a man who had likely never needed anything from anyone, was asking for her help in a way that transcended traditional care. The next morning, as Emily returned to work, she felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. She was stepping into uncharted territory, but she had given her word and she intended to keep it. When she reached Victor's room, she found him standing by the window again, dressed in a tailored suit instead of the hospital robe she had grown accustomed to seeing him in. He looked stronger today, as if her agreement had lifted a weight from his shoulders. "Good morning, Emily," he said, turning to face her. There was a hint of something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. Hope, perhaps. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she replied, her voice steady as she smiled at him. "I see you're looking better today." Victor gave a small nod. "Thanks to you," he said, his tone sincere. "Are you ready for today?" Emily took a deep breath, her heart pounding slightly in her chest. She nodded, her gaze meeting his. "I'm ready." As they prepared to leave the hospital, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the brink of something significant, something that would change not just Victor's life, but her own as well. She had no idea what awaited them, what kind of past Victor was trying to confront, but she knew one thing for certain. She was ready to stand by his side, if only for a day, and help him find whatever peace he was searching for. Emily could feel the tension in the air as she walked alongside Victor, the two of them making their way through the wide hallways of St. Mary's private hospital. The previous evening had been a whirlwind of thoughts for her, turning Victor's request over and over in her mind, wondering if she had made the right decision. Today, however, was not the time for doubts. She was committed, and whatever Victor needed from her, she would do her best to fulfill. Victor walked with deliberate steps, his tall frame, though thinner than before, still held an aura of strength and determination. He had insisted on wearing a suit for the occasion, a finely tailored, dark blue ensemble that seemed to restore some of the authority his illness had stripped from him. He looked every part the millionaire he was, but his eyes betrayed something else, something fragile that lay beneath the polished surface. He glanced at Emily as they approached the entrance, giving her a small nod of encouragement, his expression filled with gratitude that was almost unspoken. Waiting outside was a sleek black car, the kind of luxury vehicle one would expect for a man like Victor Hale. The driver, a man in his 50s with a stiff posture and a stoic expression, stepped forward to open the door for them. Victor gestured for Emily to enter first, his demeanor gentlemanly but also carrying an underlying tension. Emily slid into the car, the leather seats cool and soft beneath her. She watched as Victor followed, settling in beside her. For a moment, they sat in silence, the air thick with unspoken questions. Emily glanced at Victor, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Mr. Hale," she began, her voice cautious. "You still haven't told me where we're going." Victor turned his head, meeting her gaze. His blue eyes held a hint of something she couldn't quite place. Anxiety, perhaps, or maybe anticipation. He took a deep breath, his fingers lacing together in his lap. "I will explain everything soon, Emily. I just need you to trust me a little longer." Emily nodded, though the uncertainty gnawed at her. She had agreed to help him, but the more time passed, the more questions piled up in her mind. Why did he need her to pretend to be his wife? What kind of meeting required this kind of ruse? And what was he so afraid of? The drive through the city was quiet, the car gliding smoothly over the roads as the scenery outside changed from bustling urban streets to quieter, more affluent neighborhoods. The city began to fall away, replaced by sprawling estates and large manicured lawns. Emily stared out the window, her curiosity only growing as they ventured further away from the familiar streets of downtown. Eventually, the car slowed, turning onto a long, winding driveway that led to an imposing estate. The house was massive, an old Victorian mansion that seemed to loom over the surrounding grounds with an air of both grandeur and melancholy. Emily felt her breath catch as she took in the sight. The building looked like it had been plucked from a bygone era, with its intricate stonework, towering windows, and ivy that crawled up the sides like nature reclaiming its territory. Victor noticed her reaction and gave a small nod. "This is where it all began," he said, his voice soft, almost wistful. "Where everything started and ended." Emily turned to him, her eyes searching his face. There was a sadness there, a kind of regret that seemed to weigh heavily on him. She wanted to ask more, to understand what had brought him here, but she knew that he would only share what he was ready to. The car came to a stop, and the driver stepped out to open the door. Victor took a deep breath, his hands tightening for a moment before he exhaled and gave Emily a reassuring nod. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice carrying a mix of determination and vulnerability. Emily stepped out of the car, the cool breeze brushing against her skin as she looked up at the house. The door of the mansion opened, and a figure appeared, an older man, tall and thin, with a stern expression that softened slightly upon seeing Victor. The man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as they landed on Emily. "Victor," the man greeted, his voice carrying a hint of surprise. "You're here." Victor gave a curt nod, his gaze steady. "Hello, James. It's been a long time." James's eyes flicked to Emily, his expression questioning. Victor seemed to anticipate the unspoken inquiry. He took a step closer, his arm brushing against Emily's as he spoke. "James, this is my wife Emily," he said, the words coming out smoothly, though there was a slight tension in his voice. Emily forced a smile, her heart pounding as she extended her hand. "Nice to meet you," she said, doing her best to sound confident. James raised an eyebrow but took her hand, giving it a polite shake. "I wasn't aware you had married, Victor," he said, his gaze shifting back to Victor, his tone carrying a note of suspicion. Victor's expression didn't waver. "It was a private affair," he replied, his voice even. "But that's not why we're here. There are matters we need to discuss." James studied Victor for a moment longer before giving a slow nod. "Very well. Come inside," he said, turning and leading them toward the house. As they followed James into the mansion, Emily couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. The interior of the house was grand, high ceilings, ornate chandeliers, and walls lined with paintings that seemed to watch them as they moved through the hallway. The air was cool, and there was an almost oppressive silence that made her feel as though they were stepping into a place frozen in time. Victor walked beside her, his posture stiff, his eyes forward. Emily could feel the tension radiating off him, and she wondered what kind of history this place held. It was clear that there were memories here, memories that Victor was not eager to relive. James led them into a large drawing room, gesturing for them to sit. Emily settled onto the edge of an armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Victor took a seat beside her, his gaze focused on James, who stood by the fireplace, his expression unreadable. "So, Victor," James began, his eyes narrowing slightly, "why are you here? What is it that you wish to discuss after all these years?" Victor was silent for a moment, his eyes drifting to the fireplace, where a small flame flickered, casting shadows across the room. Emily could see the hesitation in his expression, the way his jaw tightened as he gathered his thoughts. Finally, he looked up, his gaze locking onto James. "I'm here because I need to make things right," Victor said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've spent years running from my past, pretending that it didn't matter, but I can't do that anymore. I need to confront what happened here, and I need your help to do it." James raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "And what exactly do you expect me to do?" he asked, his tone edged with bitterness. "You made your choices, Victor. You walked away from everything." Victor's eyes hardened, his hands clenching in his lap. "I know I did," he said, his voice laced with regret. "And I've lived with those choices every day since. But I'm not here for myself. I'm here for her." He glanced at Emily, his eyes softening. "For us." Emily felt her heart skip a beat at the words. She knew this was all part of the act, that Victor needed her here to play a role, to help him face whatever ghosts haunted this place. But the emotion in his voice, the way he looked at her, it felt real, as if there was something deeper beneath the surface. James studied Victor for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. Finally, he let out a long sigh, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "All right, Victor," he said, his voice softer now. "I'll hear you out. But I make no promises." Victor nodded, his expression one of relief. "That's all I ask." As the conversation continued, Emily found herself listening intently, piecing together fragments of Victor's past. She learned about the house, how it had belonged to Victor's family for generations, a symbol of wealth and status. She learned about the rift that had formed between Victor and his family, about the choices he had made that had led to him walking away from everything he had known. And she learned about the regrets that had haunted him ever since. Regrets that had brought him back here to face the past he had tried so hard to forget. Emily watched as Victor spoke, his voice filled with a mixture of regret and determination. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of the memories that seemed to press down on him. And as she listened, she realized that this was not just about closure for Victor. It was about redemption, about finding a way to move forward. The hours passed, and as the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, the tension in the room seemed to ease. James, who had started the conversation with suspicion and bitterness, seemed to soften, his expression losing some of its harshness. He looked at Victor with something resembling understanding, a hint of the old camaraderie they had once shared. "Maybe it's not too late," James said quietly, his gaze meeting Victor's. "Maybe there's still a way to make things right." Victor nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I hope so," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I truly hope so." Emily felt her heart swell with emotion as she watched the two men, their shared history heavy in the air. She realized that this moment, this reconciliation, was what Victor had been seeking, a chance to mend the broken pieces of his past, to find a way to heal. And she was honored to be a part of it, even if only for a day. As they left the mansion that evening, Victor walked beside her, his steps lighter than they had been when they arrived. He glanced at Emily, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you." Emily smiled back, her heart full. "You're welcome, Victor," she replied softly. "I'm glad I could help." And as they drove away from the estate, the lights of the city growing brighter in the distance, Emily couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning, that Victor's journey was far from over, and that perhaps, in helping him find closure, she had found something for herself as well. The days that followed their visit to Victor's father were marked by a shift, a change in the way Victor carried himself, in the way he approached each new day. The visit had been emotionally taxing, yet it had also brought a sense of relief and closure. Victor seemed lighter, as if a burden he had carried for far too long had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Emily noticed the change immediately. Victor, who had always been reserved and guarded, seemed to open up more. He spoke more freely, his words no longer weighed down by the regret and pain that had once been ever present in his voice. It was as if the visit had allowed him to make peace with his past, to accept what had happened and begin to move forward. Victor had asked Emily to continue accompanying him, not just as a nurse, but as a confidant, a partner in his journey. He trusted her, and that trust had created a bond between them, one that went beyond their original arrangement. Emily found herself spending more and more time at Donovan Manor, where Victor had temporarily moved after leaving the hospital. The estate was grand, with large windows that overlooked beautiful gardens, and while it was impressive, it also had an air of isolation about it, an emptiness that seemed to echo through the halls. One afternoon, Victor invited Emily to join him in the garden. It was a warm day, the sun shining brightly overhead, and the scent of freshly bloomed flowers filled the air. Emily followed Victor down the stone path that led to a small seating area surrounded by rose bushes. He gestured for her to sit, his demeanor relaxed, his face softened by a gentle smile. "I've been thinking a lot about what comes next," Victor began, his eyes fixed on the garden in front of them. His voice was calm, steady, as if he had finally found some sense of direction. "For years, I focused only on building wealth, on accumulating more and more. I thought it would bring me fulfillment, that it would give my life meaning. But in the end, all it did was create distance between me and the people I cared about, between me and the life I truly wanted." Emily listened, her gaze on Victor as he spoke. She could hear the honesty in his words, the way he spoke of his past with a mix of regret and acceptance. It was a side of Victor that she had only begun to see, a man who had achieved everything in terms of material success, but had lost himself along the way. Victor turned to look at Emily, his eyes meeting hers. "I want to change that," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I want to do something meaningful, something that will truly make a difference in people's lives, and I think I know where to start." Emily tilted her head slightly, curiosity shining in her eyes. "What do you have in mind, Victor?" Victor smiled, a spark of hope lighting up his expression. "My father always believed in helping others. He was a philanthropist, though I never fully appreciated it when I was younger. I want to carry on his legacy. I want to use what I have to make a real impact, to support the people and communities that need it most." Emily felt her heart swell at his words. There was a sincerity in Victor's voice that touched her deeply, a genuine desire to change not only his own life but the lives of others. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with admiration. "That's a wonderful idea, Victor. I think it's exactly what you need, what we all need, really, a way to give back, to find purpose." Victor nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "And I want you to help me, Emily," he said, his voice earnest. "You've been by my side through all of this, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather have with me as I start this new chapter." Emily felt a surge of emotion at his words. She had never imagined that her role as a nurse would lead her to this, to becoming a part of something so much bigger, to helping someone as powerful as Victor Hale find a new purpose in life. She reached out, placing her hand on top of his. "I'd be honored, Victor," she said softly. "I'd be honored to help you make a difference." The days that followed were filled with planning and discussions. Victor and Emily spent hours going over ideas, talking about the kind of impact they wanted to make and the causes that mattered most to them. They reached out to community leaders, meeting with people who worked tirelessly to support underserved populations. They visited schools, shelters, and community centers, each visit leaving a lasting impression on Victor. Emily watched as Victor transformed before her eyes. The once reclusive millionaire, who had kept the world at arm's length, was now immersing himself in the lives of others. He spoke with children at the community centers, his eyes lighting up as they shared their dreams and aspirations. He listened to the stories of those who had struggled, who had faced challenges that most people couldn't even imagine, and he offered not just financial support, but also genuine empathy. One afternoon, as they visited a small school on the outskirts of the city, Victor found himself sitting in a classroom surrounded by children. They were curious about him, their eyes wide as they asked questions about his life, about what it was like to be a millionaire. Victor smiled, his gaze softening as he spoke to them. "You know," he began, his voice gentle, "being a millionaire isn't what makes you happy. It's not about the money or the big houses or the fancy cars. What really matters is the people in your life, the kindness you show to others, and the way you make a difference. I learned that a little late, but it's never too late to change." Emily stood at the back of the classroom, her heart swelling with pride as she watched Victor interact with the children. He was no longer the guarded man she had met in the hospital, the man who had been weighed down by regret and loneliness. He had found something that brought him joy, something that gave his life meaning beyond wealth and status. Later that day, as they walked back to the car, Victor turned to Emily, his expression filled with gratitude. "I don't think I could have done this without you, Emily," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You've been my guide through all of this. You've shown me what really matters." Emily smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You had it in you all along, Victor," she replied softly. "You just needed to see it for yourself." Victor reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. They walked in silence for a moment, the connection between them unspoken yet undeniable. Emily could feel her heart pounding, her emotions swirling within her as she realized just how much Victor had come to mean to her. He was no longer just a patient, no longer just a wealthy man who needed her help. He was someone she cared deeply about, someone who had shown her a side of himself that no one else had seen. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the sky, Victor and Emily stood by the car, their hands still clasped together. Victor looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Emily," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you." Emily's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat as she looked up at him. "What is it, Victor?" Victor hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching hers. There was a vulnerability in his gaze, a hint of fear that spoke of the emotions he was struggling to put into words. He took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around hers. I've realized that you mean more to me than I ever expected. You've been my rock, my strength, and I don't think I could have gotten through any of this without you. I know this started as something else, but I care about you, Emily, more than I can say." Emily felt tears welling in her eyes, her heart swelling with emotion at his words. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the way he looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear, as if he was terrified of what her response might be. She reached up, her hand gently brushing against his cheek. "I care about you too, Victor," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "More than I ever thought possible." Victor's eyes softened, his lips curving into a smile filled with relief, with hope, with love. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm against her skin. For a moment they stood there, the world around them fading away as they held on to each other, the connection between them growing stronger with every passing second. As they finally pulled away, Victor looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "No matter what happens, Emily, I want you by my side," he said, his voice steady. "I want us to do this together, to make a difference, to build something meaningful." Emily smiled, her heart full. "I want that too, Victor. I want to be with you, to be a part of this journey." And as they drove away from the school, the city lights growing brighter in the distance, Emily knew that they were no longer just two individuals brought together by circumstance. They were partners in a journey that was just beginning, a journey filled with hope, with love, and with the promise of a better future. The past was behind them, and the future lay ahead, filled with possibilities, with challenges, and with the knowledge that together they could overcome anything. And as they held on to each other, Emily knew that this was only the beginning, that their journey of growth, of love, and of making a difference had only just begun. It had been several months since Emily and Victor embarked on their journey to make a difference in the world, and their lives had changed in ways neither of them could have imagined. Victor's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. He was no longer the guarded, isolated millionaire who had once kept everyone at arm's length. Instead, he had become a passionate advocate for change, working tirelessly to support causes that mattered to him and giving a voice to those who had none. Emily, too, had found a new purpose. Her role had shifted from being a nurse to becoming Victor's partner in his philanthropic efforts. She had never imagined that her life would take such a turn, but standing by Victor's side had shown her that there was so much more she could do, so many more lives she could touch. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day, their relationship evolving from a simple arrangement into something deeper, something built on trust, respect, and love. But as the months went by, the couple faced new challenges that would test the strength of their bond and their commitment to the path they had chosen. One evening, as Emily sat in Victor's study at Donovan Manor, she could sense that something was troubling him. The usually calm and composed Victor seemed agitated, pacing back and forth, his hands running through his hair in frustration. His eyes, normally filled with determination, were clouded with worry, and Emily could feel the tension in the air. "Victor," Emily called softly, her eyes following his restless movements. "What's going on? I've never seen you like this." Victor paused, his gaze turning to Emily. He took a deep breath, his expression softening as he walked over to her, taking a seat across from her. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. Emily frowned, her heart sinking at the uncertainty in his voice. "What is it?" she asked gently, her eyes searching his. "You know you can tell me anything, Victor." Victor nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. He was silent for a long moment, the weight of his thoughts evident in the way his shoulders slumped. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been getting threats, Emily," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Threats from people who don't want me to continue with what we're doing." Emily felt her breath catch in her throat, her heart pounding at his words. "Threats?" she repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. "What kind of threats?" Victor sighed, his fingers tightening around each other. "There are people, powerful people, who don't like the fact that I'm using my resources to help those in need. People who see our work as a threat to their interests. They've sent messages, warnings, and I ignored them at first, thinking they were just empty threats, but now, it's getting worse." Emily's eyes widened, fear gripping her chest as she looked at him. "Worse? Victor, what do you mean?" Victor took a deep breath, his jaw clenching as he tried to steady himself. "They've threatened to hurt you, Emily," he said, his voice breaking. "They know about us. They know that you're important to me, and they're using that against me." Emily felt the color drain from her face, her heart pounding in her ears as she processed his words. She could see the fear in Victor's eyes, the fear that something could happen to her because of him. She reached out, her hand gently resting on his arm, her eyes filled with concern. "Victor," she said softly, her voice trembling, "why didn't you tell me sooner?" Victor looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. "I didn't want to worry you," he said, his voice cracking. "I thought I could handle it, that I could protect you without you ever having to know. But now I'm not so sure. I can't risk losing you, Emily. I can't." Emily felt tears welling in her eyes, her heart aching at the raw vulnerability in his voice. She could see how much this was tearing him apart, the fear that his actions, his choices, could put her in danger. She shook her head, her fingers tightening around his arm. "You won't lose me, Victor," she said firmly, her voice filled with determination. "We've come this far together, and I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. You don't have to protect me alone." Victor's eyes softened, his lips curving into a small, sad smile. "You're stronger than anyone I know, Emily," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "But I can't help feeling responsible. This is my fight, not yours." Emily shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "It is my fight too, Victor. You're not alone in this, and you never will be. We'll find a way to get through this no matter what." Victor nodded, his eyes glistening with emotion. He reached out, pulling Emily into his arms, holding her tightly as if afraid that if he let go, she would slip away. Emily closed her eyes, her heart pounding as she felt the strength of his embrace, the depth of his love. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there were forces working against them that would do anything to see them fail. But she also knew that she would not abandon Victor, not when he needed her most. The days that followed were tense, the threats looming over them like a dark cloud. Victor hired additional security, ensuring that both Emily and the people they worked with were protected. But despite the precautions, there was an unease that settled over Donovan Manor, an awareness that they were being watched, that there were those who wanted to see them fail. One night, as Emily sat in the living room, she heard a noise from outside, a sharp metallic clang that sent a shiver down her spine. She stood, her heart pounding as she moved toward the window, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond. The garden was bathed in shadows, the moonlight casting eerie shapes across the lawn. Suddenly she saw a figure, a shadowy silhouette moving near the edge of the property. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening as fear gripped her chest. She turned, her voice trembling as she called out, "Victor!" Victor appeared almost immediately, his expression tense as he rushed to her side. "What is it?" he asked, his eyes following hers to the window. Emily pointed, her voice barely a whisper. "There's someone out there." Victor's eyes narrowed, his body tensing as he stepped closer to the window, his gaze locked on the figure. He turned to one of the security guards stationed near the door, his voice sharp. "Get out there. Now." The guard nodded, quickly moving outside to investigate. Victor stayed by Emily's side, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders as they watched, waiting for any sign of what was happening. Emily could feel her heart pounding, her fear growing with each passing second. She leaned into Victor, her body trembling as she tried to steady herself. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity, until finally the guard returned. He shook his head, his expression grim. "There was someone out there, but they're gone now. Couldn't catch them." Victor's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger. "Keep a close watch," he ordered. "I want to know if anything seems out of place." The guard nodded, returning to his post. Victor turned to Emily, his expression filled with a mix of anger and concern. He reached up, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her face. "I'm so sorry, Emily," he whispered, his voice filled with pain. "I never wanted you to be caught up in this." Emily shook her head, her hand covering his. "This isn't your fault, Victor," she said softly, her voice filled with determination. "We knew this wouldn't be easy, but we'll get through it. Together." Victor pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, his heart pounding against hers. He knew that she was right, that they had chosen this path together, and that they would have to face whatever challenges lay ahead. But the fear of losing her, the fear that his actions could put her in danger, was almost too much to bear. The climax came one stormy night, when the threats they had received escalated into something far more dangerous. It was late, the rain pounding against the windows, the wind howling through the trees. Emily was in the kitchen preparing tea when she heard a loud crash from the front of the house, a sound that made her blood run cold. She rushed into the foyer, her heart pounding as she saw the front door wide open, the wind blowing rain into the hallway. Victor was there, his expression filled with shock and anger as he stood face to face with a man, an intruder who had forced his way inside. The man was tall, his face obscured by a hood, his posture aggressive. Victor stepped forward, his body blocking the intruder's path, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and authority. "Who are you? What do you want?" The intruder didn't answer, his eyes shifting to Emily as she entered the room. Victor's expression darkened, his hands clenching into fists as he positioned himself between the man and Emily. "Leave her out of this," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is between you and me." The intruder smirked, his gaze flicking between Victor and Emily. "You should have listened to the warnings, Hale," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You should have walked away." Victor took a step forward, his jaw set, his eyes filled with determination. "I'm not walking away," he said firmly. "Not now, not ever. You think you can scare me into giving up, but you're wrong. I won't stop fighting for what's right." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with fear and determination. Emily watched, her heart pounding, her eyes locked on Victor. She could see the courage in his eyes, the way he refused to back down, even in the face of danger, and in that moment she knew that no matter what happened, she would stand by his side. Suddenly, the intruder lunged forward, his movements quick and aggressive. Victor reacted immediately, his body blocking the man's path, his arms pushing him back. Emily screamed, her hands flying to her mouth as she watched the struggle unfold, her heart pounding in her ears. The two men grappled, their movements frantic and desperate, Victor's strength, though diminished by his illness, was fueled by determination, by the need to protect Emily. He fought with everything he had, his eyes blazing with anger and fear for the woman he loved. In the chaos, Emily spotted a heavy vase on the table by the door. Without thinking, she rushed forward, grabbing it with both hands. She ran towards the men, her heart pounding as she swung the vase with all her strength, striking the intruder on the back. The man stumbled, his grip on Victor loosening as he fell to the floor. Victor turned, his eyes wide with shock as he looked at Emily. She stood there, her chest heaving, the vase still in her hands, her eyes filled with fear and determination. Victor reached out, pulling her into his arms, holding her tightly as the security guards rushed in, restraining the intruder and dragging him away. For a moment, everything was a blur, the noise, the rain, the chaos of the scene. But as the intruder was taken away and the door was finally closed, Victor held Emily close, his heart pounding as he whispered her name. "Emily," he said, his voice trembling. "Are you okay?" Emily nodded, her eyes glistening with tears as she looked up at him. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I was so scared, Victor. I thought I might lose you." Victor cupped her face in his hands, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. "You saved me, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us both." And in that moment, as they stood there, holding each other, Emily knew that they had faced their greatest challenge yet, and they had come through it together. The danger was far from over, but they had proven that no matter what stood in their way, they would fight for each other, for their love, and for the future they wanted to build. The storm had passed, but its effects lingered long after. The night of the intrusion had left an indelible mark on both Emily and Victor. It had brought them face to face with the very real dangers they were up against, but it had also shown them the strength of their love, the power of their unity, and the lengths they were willing to go to protect each other. The morning after the incident, the air was still tense at Donovan Manor. Security had been heightened with more guards patrolling the grounds, and Victor had made it clear that they would not take any more chances. The fear of losing Emily had been the most terrifying moment of his life, and he was determined to do everything in his power to keep her safe. Emily sat on the couch in the study, her eyes gazing out the window at the garden beyond. The sun was shining, the light filtering through the leaves and casting a warm glow across the room, but she still felt the remnants of fear in her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, her thoughts drifting to everything that had happened. She had always known that the path they had chosen would be difficult, that they would face opposition from those who did not want to see change. But the events of the previous night had been a harsh reminder of just how dangerous their mission was. Victor entered the room, his footsteps soft as he approached her. He watched her for a moment, his heart aching at the sight of her sitting there, her face pale, her eyes distant. He moved closer, kneeling in front of her, his hands gently resting on her knees. "Emily," he said softly, his voice filled with concern. Emily blinked, her eyes focusing on Victor as she looked down at him. She gave him a small, tired smile, her hand reaching out to touch his face. "Hey," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Victor took her hand in his, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes searching hers for any sign of how she was truly feeling. Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I think so," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's just everything that happened last night. It made me realize how real all of this is, how much we're risking." Victor's eyes softened, his heart aching at the fear in her voice. He reached up, cupping her face in his hands, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know, Emily," he said quietly. "I know how scary this is, and I hate that you've been put in danger because of me. But I promise you, I will do everything in my power to keep you safe." Emily closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, her heart swelling with love for the man in front of her. She knew that Victor meant every word, that he would move heaven and earth to protect her. But she also knew that the world they were fighting against was ruthless, that the people who opposed them would stop at nothing to see them fail. She opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. "Victor," she began, her voice filled with determination. I don't want to live in fear. I don't want us to be afraid to keep doing what we believe in. We started this journey because we wanted to make a difference, to help those who need it most. And I still want that. I still believe in what we're doing. Victor's eyes glistened with emotion, his heart swelling with pride at her words. He nodded, his hands brushing away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. You're right, he said, his voice steady. We can't let them scare us into giving up. We have to keep going for ourselves and for everyone who's counting on us. Emily smiled, her eyes filled with love. She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his, her voice barely a whisper. We're stronger together, Victor. And as long as we have each other, I know we can face anything. Victor closed his eyes, his heart filled with a mixture of love, gratitude, and determination. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, holding her as if to shield her from the world. In that moment, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The weeks that followed were filled with both challenges and triumphs. The threats had not ceased, but Victor and Emily had refused to back down. They continued their work, meeting with community leaders, supporting the causes that mattered most to them, and using Victor's resources to make a difference in the lives of those who needed it most. Victor had made the decision to speak publicly about the threats they had received. It was a bold move, one that could potentially put them at even greater risk, but he knew it was necessary. The world needed to know the truth, that there were forces at play that sought to keep people oppressed, that there were those who would stop at nothing to maintain their power and control, and Victor was determined to shine a light on that darkness, to expose the corruption that had long been hidden. The press conference was held in the garden at Donovan Manor, a place that had once felt empty and isolated but now felt alive with purpose. Reporters gathered, their cameras pointed at the podium where Victor stood, Emily by his side. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, the air thick with the weight of what was about to be said. Victor took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the crowd before him. He could see the curiosity in their eyes, the hunger for a story. But this wasn't just a story. It was his life, their life, and the lives of countless others who had been affected by the actions of those who sought to keep them silent. He began to speak, his voice steady, his words filled with conviction. He spoke of the threats they had faced, the dangers that had loomed over them, and the reasons why they had chosen to continue despite it all. He spoke of the importance of standing up for what was right, of using one's power and privilege to uplift others, to create a world where everyone had a chance to thrive. As he spoke, Emily watched him, her heart swelling with pride. She could see the passion in his eyes, the way he spoke from the heart, unafraid of the consequences. He was no longer just a millionaire seeking redemption. He was a leader, a voice for those who had none, a beacon of hope in a world that so often seemed dark. When Victor finished, there was a moment of silence, the weight of his words hanging in the air. And then, slowly, the crowd began to applaud. It started as a gentle ripple, then grew, the sound echoing through the garden, a testament to the impact of his words. Victor turned to Emily, his eyes filled with emotion as he reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining. Emily smiled at him, her eyes glistening with tears. She knew that this was just the beginning, that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew that they were ready for it. They had faced their fears, confronted the dangers, and come out stronger on the other side. After the press conference, as the crowd began to disperse, Victor and Emily stood together, their hands still clasped. They watched as people approached, offering their support, their gratitude for the work they were doing. It was a moment of validation, a reminder that their efforts were not in vain, that they were making a difference, one step at a time. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the garden, Victor turned to Emily, his eyes filled with love. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You've been my strength, my courage. You've shown me what truly matters." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with love for the man standing before her. "And you've shown me that even in the face of fear, we can choose hope," she replied softly. We can choose to make a difference, to fight for what's right, no matter the cost. Victor leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a gentle kiss, a promise of their love and commitment to each other and to the journey they had chosen. And as they stood there, the world around them bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, they knew that they had found something far more valuable than wealth or power. They had found purpose, love, and the strength to face whatever lay ahead. In the weeks that followed, Victor and Emily continued their work, their efforts expanding as more and more people came forward to support their cause. They established a foundation, one dedicated to providing education, healthcare, and opportunities to underserved communities. It was the culmination of everything they had fought for, a way to ensure that their work would continue, that their vision of a better world would become a reality. Emily found herself deeply involved in the foundation's work, her background in nursing giving her insight into the healthcare initiatives they were developing. She worked with doctors, nurses, and community leaders to create programs that would provide access to medical care for those who had none. It was challenging work, but it was also deeply rewarding, and she knew that this was where she was meant to be. Victor, too, had found his place. He used his influence to rally support, to bring together business leaders, philanthropists, and advocates who shared their vision. He spoke at conferences, met with government officials, and used every resource at his disposal to create change. He was no longer just a businessman, he was an advocate, a champion for those who had been forgotten. Together, they built something that was more than just a foundation. It was a movement, a testament to the power of hope, of love, and of the belief that change was possible. And as they stood on the stage at the foundation's opening ceremony, their hands clasped together, they knew that they had found something far more valuable than anything they could have imagined. The audience applauded, their faces filled with hope, their eyes shining with the promise of a better future. Victor turned to Emily, his eyes filled with love and pride. He leaned in, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke. "We did it, Emily. We made it." Emily smiled, her heart full as she looked at the man she loved. "We did it together, Victor," she replied softly, "and this is only the beginning." And as they looked out at the crowd, at the people whose lives they had touched, they knew that their journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome, but they also knew that they would face them together. And with that knowledge, they knew that they could face anything, that their love, their hope, and their determination would guide them, no matter what lay ahead. The past was behind them and the future was filled with endless possibilities. And as they stood there hand in hand, they knew that they were ready for whatever came next. Together, the early morning sun filtered through the curtains of Victor and Emily's room, bathing the space in a warm, golden light. Emily lay in bed, her head resting on Victor's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It had become her favorite way to wake up, wrapped in his warmth, feeling the gentle rise and fall of his breathing, the quiet reassurance that he was there with her. She opened her eyes, glancing up at his face, a soft smile playing on her lips as she watched him sleep, his expression relaxed and peaceful. They had come so far together, and as she lay there, Emily couldn't help but reflect on everything they had been through, the challenges they had faced, the fears they had conquered, and the love they had found along the way. There was a sense of peace now, a feeling that they were exactly where they were meant to be, that the struggles of the past had only made them stronger, bringing them to this moment. Victor stirred, his eyes slowly opening, a sleepy smile tugging at the corners of his lips as he looked down at her. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice still thick with sleep. Emily smiled, her fingers tracing gentle patterns on his chest. "Good morning," she replied softly. She leaned up, pressing a gentle kiss to his lips, her heart swelling with love for the man beside her. Victor wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, his eyes filled with warmth as he looked at her. "You know," he began, his voice filled with emotion, "I don't think I've ever been this happy." Emily felt her heart swell at his words, her smile widening. "Me neither," she whispered. She knew that the happiness they had found was not the result of luck or chance. It was something they had fought for, something they had built together through every trial and every triumph. It was the result of their unwavering commitment to each other, their willingness to face whatever challenges came their way, and their shared belief in the power of hope and love. They spent the morning together, taking their time, enjoying the simple pleasure of being in each other's presence. There were no pressing meetings, no urgent matters to attend to, just the two of them savoring the peace they had worked so hard to create. Eventually, they got up, moving through their morning routine with an ease that spoke of the deep connection they had forged, their movements fluid and in sync as if they were two halves of a whole. Later, as they sat together on the terrace overlooking the expansive gardens of Donovan Manor, Emily turned to Victor, her eyes filled with curiosity. "What do you see for the future, Victor?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Where do you see us going from here?" Victor leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the horizon, his expression thoughtful. He was silent for a moment, considering her question, before turning to meet her gaze. "I see us continuing to do what we've started," he said, his voice steady. "I see us expanding the foundation, reaching more people, creating more opportunities for those who have none. I see us traveling, meeting new people, learning about their stories, and finding ways to help." He paused, his eyes softening as he reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "But more than anything, I see us together," he continued, his voice filled with love. "I see us building a life that's filled with purpose, with joy, and with each other. I see us growing old together, surrounded by the people we've helped, by the difference we've made in the world." Emily felt tears welling in her eyes at his words, her heart swelling with emotion. She squeezed his hand, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I love that vision, Victor," she said softly. "I love the idea of growing old with you, of building a life that's meaningful not just for us but for everyone we can help." Victor smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, his voice barely a whisper. "Then let's do it, Emily. Let's create that future together." And so they did. The foundation grew over the years, expanding its reach to communities far and wide. Victor and Emily dedicated themselves to the work, traveling across the country and even to other parts of the world, meeting with local leaders, supporting grassroots initiatives, and working to ensure that their resources were used to create lasting change. It was exhausting at times, the challenges often seeming insurmountable, but they never wavered. They faced each obstacle with determination, with the knowledge that what they were doing mattered. They had built a team of passionate, dedicated individuals, people who shared their vision and worked tirelessly to bring it to life. The foundation became a beacon of hope, a symbol of what was possible when people came together with a shared purpose. It provided education, healthcare, and opportunities for those who had been overlooked, ensuring that no one was left behind. Victor and Emily's relationship continued to flourish, their bond growing stronger with each passing year. They had built a partnership that was not just about love, but about mutual respect, support, and a shared vision for the future. They celebrated their successes together, comforted each other through the challenges, and always found time to nurture their relationship, no matter how busy their lives became. One summer evening, as they sat on the porch of a small house they had rented during one of their trips, Emily looked at Victor, her heart swelling with love for the man sitting beside her. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow across the landscape, and the air was filled with the sound of crickets chirping in the distance. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his. "Do you remember when you first asked me to pretend to be your wife?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of nostalgia and amusement. Victor chuckled, his eyes twinkling with affection as he looked at her. "How could I forget?" he replied. "I remember thinking that it was the most desperate thing I'd ever done, and I remember being terrified that you'd say no." Emily smiled, her heart swelling at the memory. "I almost did, you know," she teased, her eyes glancing at him playfully. "But there was something about you, something that made me want to help." Victor raised an eyebrow, his expression curious. "Oh? And what was that?" Emily's smile softened, her eyes meeting his. "I could see how lonely you were, Victor," she said, her voice gentle. "I could see the pain you were carrying, the regret, and I wanted to be there for you. I wanted to help you find the peace you were looking for." Victor's eyes filled with emotion, his heart swelling with love for the woman sitting beside him. He reached for her, pulling her into his arms, his voice filled with gratitude. "You did more than that, Emily," he whispered. "You changed my life. You gave me hope when I had none, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the love you've given me." Emily's eyes glistened with tears, her heart overflowing with love. She leaned up, pressing a gentle kiss to his lips, her voice barely a whisper as she replied, "You already are, Victor. You've given me more than I ever dreamed of. You've given me a purpose, a partner, and a love that I will cherish for the rest of my life." Victor smiled, his eyes shining with love as he held her close, his heart filled with a sense of peace that he had never known before. As they sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the sun dip below the horizon, they knew that they had found something truly special, a love that had been forged through hardship, through triumph, and through a shared desire to make the world a better place. Years passed, and the world continued to change, but through it all, Victor and Emily remained steadfast in their mission. They watched as the foundation grew beyond anything they had imagined, its impact reaching across borders and touching the lives of countless individuals. They celebrated the successes of the people they had helped, the children who had been given an education, the families who had received health care, the communities that had been uplifted. And as they grew older, they found joy in the simple moments, the quiet mornings spent together, the laughter shared over a meal, the warmth of each other's embrace. They had built a life that was rich not in material wealth, but in love, in purpose, and in the knowledge that they had made a difference. One autumn afternoon, as they sat on the porch of Donovan Manor, now a place filled with memories of love, laughter, and hope, Emily looked at Victor, her eyes filled with contentment. The leaves were turning, their vibrant colors painting the landscape in shades of red, orange, and gold, and there was a cool breeze in the air. Victor looked at her, his eyes filled with love, his hand reaching for hers. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Emily smiled, her heart swelling as she nodded. "All the time," she replied softly. "I think about everything we've been through, everything we've accomplished, and I feel so grateful. Grateful for you, for this life we've built, and for the love that has carried us through it all." Victor squeezed her hand, his eyes glistening with tears. "I feel the same way, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I will spend every day of the rest of my life loving you." Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart filled with a deep, abiding love for the man beside her. "And I will spend every day loving you, Victor," she whispered, and as they sat there watching the leaves fall, the world around them quiet and serene, they knew that they had found something truly special, a love that had endured through every trial, that had grown stronger with each passing year, and that would continue to light their path for the rest of their lives. They had faced the darkness together, and they had emerged into the light, and now as they sat side by side, their hands intertwined, they knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be, together, forever, with a love that would never fade.